$2. Boone Harwick's weathered hand shot up like lightning as the auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the dusty air of Cedar Creek's town square. The crowd turned to stare at the mountain of a man whose voice had just shattered the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the human auction like morning frost. The woman on the makeshift wooden platform stood perfectly still, her entire head concealed beneath a burlap sack that someone had tied roughly around her neck with twine. Her hands, delicate despite the dirt beneath her fingernails, trembled slightly at her sides. The autumn wind of 1887 whipped through the small Montana settlement, causing her tattered brown dress to flutter against her legs. $2 going once. The auctioneer called, his voice cracking with disbelief. Nobody else had bid on the mysterious woman who'd been brought in with a wagon full of orphans and destitute souls from the disbanded mining camp up north. Boone felt every eye in Cedar Creek boring into his broad shoulders. The other lumberjacks from his crew shuffled their boots in the dirt, whispering among themselves. Widow Prescott clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Even Pastor McKinnon looked scandalized, though he'd been the one to organize this charity auction to find homes and work for the displaced miners' families. She could be diseased, someone called out from the crowd. That's why they got her head covered. Could be a criminal, another voice added. Boone stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the platform. At 6 feet 4 inches, with arms like tree trunks from 20 years of swinging an axe, he commanded attention without trying. His black beard, streaked with premature silver at 32, framed a face that rarely smiled but held kind eyes the color of pine needles. $2 going twice. The auctioneer's hammer trembled in his grip. The woman's breathing quickened beneath the sack. Boone could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, and something in that desperate rhythm made his decision final. He'd lived alone in his cabin on Timber Ridge for 5 years, ever since he'd arrived in Montana territory, with nothing but an axe and a broken heart from losing his family to scarlet fever back in Ohio. He'd grown tired of talking only to his horse and the wind. Sold to Boone Harwick for $2. The gavel cracked against the wooden podium like a gunshot. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others muttering about the lumberjack's foolishness. Widow Prescott marched over, her black dress rustling with indignation. "Boone Harwick, what in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "That woman could be anyone. A murderer, a thief, a human being who needs help." Boone interrupted quietly, fishing $2 silver from his leather pouch. He handed them to the auctioneer, then walked up the platform steps with surprising gentleness for such a large man. The woman backed away as he approached, her hands raised defensively. But Boone stopped 3 feet from her, removed his worn felt hat, and spoke in a voice soft as falling snow. "Ma'am, I'm Boone Harwick. I've got a cabin up on the ridge with plenty of room and honest work if you're willing. You don't have to be afraid." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly the woman's hands dropped to her sides. Boone's cabin sat nestled among towering pines on Timber Ridge, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the crisp October sky. The 2-hour ride from town had passed in complete silence. The mysterious woman perched rigidly on the wagon seat beside him, still wearing the burlap sack over her head. Every few minutes, Boone had glanced sideways at her, wondering what circumstances had led to this moment. Now, as he helped her down from the wagon, he could feel her entire body shaking. Whether from cold, fear, or something else entirely, he couldn't tell. "Let's get you inside where it's warm," he said gently, leading her up the porch steps he'd hewn from pine logs with his own hands. The cabin was modest but solid, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, handmade furniture, and windows that looked out over the vast Montana wilderness. The woman stood frozen just inside the doorway, her head turning slowly as she took in her surroundings. through whatever holes were cut in the burlap sack. Boone busied himself stoking the fire, giving her time to adjust. He'd learned patience from years of working alone in the woods, where rushing led to mistakes and mistakes could be deadly. "Are you hungry?" he asked, not turning around. "I've got stew simmering." A small voice, barely above a whisper, came from behind him. "Why?" Boone paused, poker in hand. "Why what, ma'am? Why did you bid on me?" Everyone else was afraid. He set down the poker and finally turned to face her. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be afraid, to have nowhere to go." The woman's hands went to the twine around her neck, fingers working at the knots. "I should tell you," she said, her voice growing stronger, "before you see me. I'm not what most folks would call pretty. There was an accident when I was younger, a fire." Boone's heart clenched. "Ma'am, it doesn't matter to me what you look like. What matters is that you're safe." Her hand stilled. "You mean that?" "I do." For several heartbeats, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then, with deliberate movements, she untied the twine and pulled the burlap sack from her head. Boone's breath caught, not from horror as she'd expected, but from surprise. The left side of her face bore the telltale marks of old burned scars, puckered skin that pulled slightly at her eye and the corner of her mouth. But her right profile was untouched, revealing delicate features and hair the color of autumn wheat that fell in waves to her shoulders. Most striking of all were her eyes, violet blue like wild lupine flowers, filled with intelligence and a strength that spoke of survival against impossible odds. "My name," she said, lifting her chin with defiant dignity, "is Cordelia Ashworth." The name hit Boone like a physical blow. He took a step backward, his face going pale beneath his dark beard. "Cordelia Ashworth," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of each syllable. "You know that name," she observed, her scarred features showing concern. Boone sank into the chair beside his table, his large hands shaking slightly. "Cordelia Ashworth. From Ohio. Your father was Methodist preacher Jacob Ashworth." Now it was her turn to step back, her eyes wide with shock. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because," Boone said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was supposed to marry you 7 years ago." The wooden spoon clattered to the floor as Cordelia's hand flew to her mouth. The sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence of the cabin, while outside the wind picked up, rattling the windows like ghostly fingers trying to get in. "Boone Harwick," she whispered, her violet eyes searching his face with new recognition. "Boone from the lumber mill. Father said you died in the fire with your family." "Everyone thought I did." Boone rose slowly from his chair, moving with the careful deliberation of a man afraid he might shatter something precious. "I was supposed to be home that night. Should have been there when the scarlet fever took my ma and sisters. But I was out at your father's house instead, asking for your hand proper like." Cordelia's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into the other chair. "The night before the fire at our church," she said, her voice distant with memory. "I remember now. You came to speak with Father about us marrying in the spring. Your pa gave his blessing," Boone continued, his own memories flooding back like a dam bursting. "Said he'd been watching me, saw how I looked at you during Sunday services, how you'd blush whenever I tipped my hat to you after church. Then—" "Why?" Cordelia's voice broke. "Why didn't you come back? When I woke up in the doctor's house with half my face burned, they told me everyone from your family was dead, that you'd perished trying to save them." Boone's massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Because I was a coward. When I came home and found the house still smoking, neighbors told me 3 people had died inside. They assumed I was one of them since I wasn't around to correct them. I let them think it because I couldn't face what I'd done." "What you'd done?" Cordelia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. You didn't cause that fever, Boone. Might as well have. His voice was rough with 7 years of suppressed guilt. If I'd been home, maybe I could have gotten them to the doctor sooner. Instead, I was out courting while my family was dying. Cordelia moved closer to him, her scarred hand reaching out hesitantly before falling back to her side. And I was trapped in a burning church because I stayed behind to help Mrs. Patterson find her dropped Bible. We both blame ourselves for things beyond our control. After I buried them, Boone continued, staring into the fire, I couldn't stay in Ohio. Couldn't face anyone who knew me, knew what I'd failed to do. So I disappeared. Let people think Boone Harwick died that night too, in a way. I looked for you, Cordelia said quietly. When I was well enough to travel, I went to your family's graves. Saw 3 headstones but no 4th. I hoped. She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself. You hoped what? That you were alive somewhere. That maybe you'd come back for me. A bitter laugh escaped her. Then weeks turned to months, months to years. Father remarried a woman who couldn't stand looking at my face. When he died 2 years later, she made it clear I wasn't welcome. I've been moving from town to town ever since, taking whatever work I could find. Boone turned to face her fully, his green eyes intense with emotion. How did you end up at that auction? Cordelia's hand unconsciously touched the scarred side of her face. The mining camp where I'd been working as a cook got shut down last month. When they loaded up the families to bring them here, I had nowhere else to go. But when we got to Cedar Creek, nobody wanted to hire someone who looked like me. The camp supervisor said if nobody claimed me at the auction, they'd have to send me to the territorial poorhouse, so you covered your face. I thought maybe if someone couldn't see the scars, they might give me a chance. Show them I could work hard, earn my keep. She laughed bitterly. Instead, it just made people more afraid. They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of 7 lost years hanging between them like a physical presence. Finally, Boone spoke. Cordelia, I need you to know something. That night I came to your father, it wasn't just about asking permission to court you proper. I was going to ask him to marry us right then and there. Her violet eyes widened. What? I'd already built this cabin. Already cleared land for farming. I had it all planned out, thought we'd have our whole lives ahead of us. Cordelia felt tears burning behind her eyes. And now? Boone stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark beard, the lines that sorrow had etched around his eyes. Now I'm wondering if maybe fate brought us both to that auction today for a reason. Dawn crept through the cabin windows like a shy animal, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Cordelia had spent the night in Boone's bed while he took the floor beside the fireplace, both of them lying awake listening to the other's breathing, neither quite believing the impossible reunion that had unfolded. Now, as she stood at the window watching Boone split firewood in the yard below, Cordelia marveled at how little he'd changed. His movements still held that same economical grace she remembered, each swing of the axe precise and powerful. But there was something different to a weight to his shoulders that hadn't been there 7 years ago. Lines around his eyes that spoke of nights spent wrestling with regret. The sound of his boots on the porch steps made her step back from the window. When he entered, carrying an armload of split pine, she was already at the stove stirring a pot of coffee. "Morning," he said quietly, setting the wood beside the fireplace. "Morning." She didn't turn around, suddenly shy in the light of day. "I hope you don't mind, I made breakfast. Found some eggs and bacon in your pantry. I don't mind." He washed his hands in the basin, then sat at the table. "Cordelia, we need to talk." Her hand stilled on the coffee pot. Here it comes, she thought, the polite dismissal. Now that he'd had time to think about it, to really look at her scarred face in the daylight, he'd realized his mistake. She turned. Slowly, prepared for rejection, but instead found him holding something in his hands. It was a small wooden box, worn smooth from handling. "I never threw this away," Boone said, his voice husky with emotion. "Carried it with me from Ohio to Montana. Told myself I kept it to remember what I'd lost. But maybe I kept it because some part of me never stopped hoping." Cordelia's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small diamond, nothing fancy, but clearly chosen with love and saved for with sacrifice. "I bought this for you 7 years ago," he continued. "Went to the jeweler in Columbus and picked it out special. Was going to give it to you after your father married us." She sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling. "Boone ... double quotes. I know I got no right to ask," he said quickly. "I know 7 years is a long time, and we're different people now. You might not feel the same way about me, might not want." "Stop," she whispered, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "Just stop." He fell silent, his green eyes searching her face desperately. "You want to know what I thought about all those nights?" Cordelia asked. "Lying in whatever cold room I could afford, wondering if I'd ever find a place where I belonged? I thought about you. About the way you used to look at me like I was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen." "You still are," Boone said fiercely. "These scars don't change that, Cordelia. They're just proof of how strong you are, how much you've survived." Tears spilled down her cheeks, tracing the puckered skin on the left side of her face. "After the fire, men would cross the street to avoid looking at me. Children would point and whisper. I started to believe I was hideous, that no one could ever love me like this." Boone stood up abruptly, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. With infinite gentleness, he cupped her scarred cheek in his palm. "Then, they were all fools," he said simply, "because you're even more beautiful now than you were at 19. These marks tell a story of courage, of a woman who refused to give up even when the world turned its back on her." "Boone," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "Marry me, Cordelia," he said, his voice rough with years of longing. "Not because I bought you at some damn auction, but because I loved you 7 years ago and I love you still. Because we've both been alone long enough." She stared at him through her tears, seeing not the broken man who'd blamed himself for his family's death, but the gentle giant who'd defended her against a crowd's fear, who'd offered her safety without asking for anything in return. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." Boone's face transformed, years of pain melting away as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time for her to come home. "When?" he asked, pressing his forehead against hers. Cordelia smiled, the expression pulling at her scars but lighting up her entire face. "How about today? We've already waited 7 years. I don't want to wait another day." Outside, the Montana wind sang through the pines like a wedding hymn, and for the first time since that terrible fire, both Boone and Cordelia felt like they had finally come home. Pastor McKinnon's hands shook as he held his worn Bible, not from age but from sheer amazement at the scene unfolding in Cedar Creek's small wooden church. Word had spread like wildfire through the settlement after Boone and Cordelia had ridden into town that morning, hand in hand, requesting an immediate wedding ceremony. The church was packed beyond capacity. Half the town had come out of curiosity, the other half out of genuine affection for the gentle giant who'd quietly helped so many of them over the years, fixing roofs after storms, sharing his hunting kill with struggling families, never asking for anything in return. Widow Prescott sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She'd been the first to apologize to Cordelia, admitting she'd spoken harshly at the auction out of fear for Boone's safety. "But I can see now," she'd whispered. "The way he looks at you, that's the look of a man who's found his missing piece." Cordelia stood at the altar wearing a simple blue dress that Widow Prescott had pressed into her hands an hour earlier. "It was my daughter's," the elderly woman had explained. "She died of consumption before she could wear it to her own wedding. I'd like someone to get happiness from it." The dress fit as if it had been made for her, and Cordelia had left her. Hair down, the wheat-colored waves catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the church's single stained glass window. She wore no veil, no attempt to hide her scars. Instead, she held her head high, violet eyes bright with joy. Boone stood beside her in his best shirt and pants, his dark hair slicked back and his beard freshly trimmed. But his eyes never left Cordelia's face, as if he were afraid she might disappear if he looked away. "Dearly beloved," Pastor McKinnon began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Boone Harwick and Cordelia Ashworth in holy matrimony." At the mention of Cordelia's full name, several older townspeople exchanged glances of recognition. The Ashworth name had been known throughout Ohio. Jacob Ashworth had been a respected preacher whose daughter's tragic fate had been whispered about in churches across 3 counties. These 2 souls have traveled a long and difficult path to reach this moment, the pastor continued, looking directly at the couple. They have known loss, separation, and sorrow. But they have also found their way back to each other, guided, perhaps by the same divine hand that has watched over them both. Boone's voice was steady and strong as he recited his vows, each word carrying the weight of 7 years of regret and hope. "I, Boone Harwick, take you, Cordelia Ashworth, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I vow never to leave you again, never to let fear or pride come between us." When it was Cordelia's turn, her voice trembled with emotion but grew stronger with each word. "I, Cordelia Ashworth, take you, Boone Harwick, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, support you, and stand by your side through whatever comes. I vow to trust in your love even when the world tells me I'm not worthy of it." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as they exchanged rings, the same ring Boone had carried for 7 years and a simple gold band he'd purchased from the town jeweler that morning. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Pastor McKinnon declared, his voice ringing with joy, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Boone, you may kiss your bride." The church erupted in cheers and applause as Boone cupped Cordelia's face in his large hands and kissed her with 7 years of pent-up love and longing. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor McKinnon announced over the continuing applause, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Boone Harwick." As they walked back down the aisle together, Cordelia marveled at the faces surrounding them, no longer fearful or pitying, but genuinely happy for the couple who'd found their way back to each other against impossible odds. Outside the church, the entire town had organized an impromptu celebration. Tables appeared laden with food, someone produced a fiddle, and soon the dusty main street of Cedar Creek was alive with music and dancing. Doc Patterson, the town physician, pulled Boone aside as the sun began to set. "That woman of yours," he said, nodding toward Cordelia, who was laughing with a group of children who'd gathered around her, fascinated by her stories, "she's got healing hands. Spent the afternoon helping me tend to old Mrs. Kowalski's arthritis. Natural-born healer, if you ask me." Boone watched his new wife with pride swelling in his chest. She was glowing with happiness, the scars on her face seeming to fade in the golden light of acceptance and love. "Mr. Harwick?" A small voice tugged at his pants leg. He looked down to see little Timothy Chun, the blacksmith's son, holding up a wildflower bouquet. "This is for Mrs. Harwick," the boy said solemnly. "Mama says every bride should have flowers." Boone knelt down to the boy's level. That's mighty thoughtful, Timothy. Why don't you give them to her yourself? As he watched the child present the flowers to Cordelia, saw her face light up with delight as she bent to hug him. Boone knew their future was going to be everything he'd dreamed of 7 years ago, and more. 6 months after their wedding, Cordelia stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Boone work in the garden they'd planted together. The harsh Montana winter had given way to a glorious spring, and their small homestead was thriving in ways neither of them had dared to imagine. The cabin now boasted 3 rooms instead of 2. Boone had spent the winter months adding a proper kitchen and a small room that served as Cordelia's medical clinic. Word of her healing abilities had spread throughout the valley, and hardly a day passed without someone riding up their mountain path seeking her help. "Mrs. Harwick," a voice called from the trail below. Cordelia shaded her eyes against the morning sun and saw Martha Fletcher climbing toward the cabin, her youngest son cradled in her arms. "Little Joseph's fever won't break," Martha panted as she reached the porch. "Doc Patterson's out delivering the Morrison baby, and I didn't know where else to turn." "Bring him inside," Cordelia said immediately, ushering the worried mother into her clinic. The room was simple but well organized, with shelves lined with glass jars containing herbs she'd gathered and dried herself, and a clean examination table Boone had built to her specifications. As Cordelia examined the feverish toddler, Boone appeared in the doorway. He'd learned not to interrupt when she was working, but always stayed close by in case she needed him. "It's just a spring cold that's settled in his chest," Cordelia diagnosed, her gentle hands feeling the child's swollen glands. "But we need to bring that fever down." She turned to her herb cabinet, selecting willow bark and elderflower. "I'll make a tea for him, and you'll need to keep him cool with damp cloths." Within an hour, little Joseph's fever had broken and he was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. Martha Fletcher pressed a still warm loaf of bread into Cordelia's hands as payment, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you always know exactly what's wrong?" Cordelia smiled, unconsciously touching the scarred side of her face, a gesture that had become less frequent as her confidence grew. "Pain teaches you to recognize pain in others," she said simply, "and healing comes from love." After Martha left, Boone found Cordelia sitting on their porch, watching the sun climb higher over the pine-covered mountains. He settled beside her on the bench he'd made from a fallen oak, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You've got that look," he observed, studying her profile. "What look?" "The one you get when you're thinking about something important." He turned slightly to face her. "What's on your mind, Mrs. Harwick?" Cordelia leaned into his warmth, marveling as she did every day at how natural this had become, the easy affection, the comfortable silences, the way they'd fallen into a rhythm together as if they'd never been apart. "I was thinking about purpose," she said, "about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things. If there hadn't been that fire, I never would have learned about healing herbs from Dr. Phillips while I was recovering. If you hadn't lost your family, you never would have come to Montana. And we never would have found each other again," Boone finished, understanding. "Exactly." She turned to meet his eyes. "I spent so many years angry about these scars, convinced they'd ruined my life, but now I think they might have been preparing me for this, for helping people, for being useful in a way I never could have been as just a preacher's pretty daughter." Boone lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You were always more than just pretty, Cordelia. Even when we were young, you had this light in you. The fire didn't take that away, it just made it stronger." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Finally, Cordelia spoke again, her voice soft with wonder. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd married 7 years ago like we planned?" "Sometimes," Boone admitted. "But I think we needed those years apart, hard as they were. I needed to learn that running from pain doesn't heal it. And you needed to discover just how strong you really are. And now? Boone stood up, extending his hand to her. Now we build the life we were always meant to have, together. As Cordelia took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, she felt a familiar flutter of excitement in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had on their wedding day, the sense that their story was just beginning. "Come on," Boone said, leading her toward the garden. "Those tomatoes won't plant themselves, and I want to get the new henhouse finished before evening." Cordelia laughed, following her husband into their carefully tended plot of earth. As she knelt beside him to plant seeds that would feed them through the next winter, she thought about roots, how they grew strongest in soil that had been broken and enriched by what came before. Their love had grown the same way. She realized, stronger for having been tested, deeper for having been lost and found again. The telegram arrived on a gray September morning, delivered by young Pete Morrison, who'd ridden hard from town, his horse lathered with sweat. Cordelia was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between two tall pines when she saw the dust cloud rising from the trail. "Mrs. Harwick," Pete called, waving the yellow paper above his head. "Telegram for you and Mr. Harwick." Boone emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing a broken wagon wheel, his face immediately growing serious. In their remote mountain settlement, telegrams rarely brought good news. Cordelia's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, her violet eyes scanning the brief message. Her face went pale, and she sank onto the porch steps as if her legs had given out. "What is it?" Boone was beside her in an instant, his large hand settling protectively on her shoulder. "It's from my stepmother back in Ohio," Cordelia whispered, her voice barely audible. She says the territorial authorities have been asking questions about the fire 7 years ago. Someone's claiming I said it deliberately." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Pete Morrison, still sitting on his horse, had the grace to look away as Boone's face went thunderous. "That's impossible," Boone said firmly. "You nearly died in that fire." "But there's more." Cordelia's voice was hollow as she continued reading. "She says a man named Jasper Crowley has come forward, claiming he saw me pour lamp oil around the church before the service started. He's telling people I was angry about my father remarrying, that I wanted to burn down his church in revenge." Boone's jaw tightened. He remembered Jasper Crowley, a bitter, drunken man who'd held a grudge against Preacher Ashworth for refusing to perform his wedding to a married woman. Crowley had been thrown out of the church more than once for disrupting services. "There's going to be a hearing," Cordelia continued, her scarred hand shaking. "If I don't appear to answer these charges, they'll issue a warrant for my arrest." Pete Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Harwick, I'm real sorry about this news. My ma wanted me to tell you that nobody in Cedar Creek believes a word of it. We all know what kind of person you are." After Pete left, Boone and Cordelia sat in stunned silence on their porch, watching the shadows lengthen across their carefully tended homestead. Everything they'd built together, their home, their happiness, their place in the community suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. "I have to go back," Cordelia said finally. "I have to face this." "We have to go back," Boone corrected gently. "You're not facing anything alone ever again." The next morning, they began preparations for the long journey to Ohio. Word of their situation had somehow spread through Cedar Creek, probably through Pete Morrison's well-meaning but loose tongue, and by afternoon, their cabin was filled with visitors. Widow Prescott arrived with a traveling trunk filled with Cordelia's best clothes. "You'll need to look respectable for those Ohio folks," she said briskly, though her eyes were red from crying. Doc Patterson brought a leather portfolio filled with testimonials from everyone Cordelia had treated over the past months. "Character witnesses," he explained. "Every person you've helped, every life you've touched. Let them try to paint you as some kind of firebug when they see this. Most surprising of all was the visit from Judge Harrison, Cedar Creek's territorial magistrate, who rode up to their cabin just as the sun was setting. He was an elderly man with a reputation for fairness and an absolute intolerance for injustice. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, removing his hat as he entered their cabin, "I've come to offer my services. I practiced law back in Pennsylvania before coming west, and I'd like to represent you at this hearing." Cordelia stared at him in amazement. "Judge Harrison, I couldn't possibly afford. Who said anything about payment?" The old man interrupted gruffly. "I've watched you work, young lady, seen how you've given of yourself to this community. If there's one thing I can't abide, it's seeing good people persecuted by those who wouldn't know righteousness if it bit them on the backside." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind sing through the pines, Cordelia turned to Boone with tears in her eyes. "What if they don't believe me?" she whispered. "What if they think these scars are proof of my guilt instead of evidence of my innocence?" Boone pulled her closer, his strong arms encircling her like a fortress. "Then we'll come back here and we'll build a new life somewhere else if we have to. But Cordelia, I know you. I know your heart. And I believe that truth has a way of rising to the surface even when people try to bury it. Promise me something," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you won't disappear again. Promise me you won't run." Boone's arms tightened around her. "I promise. We face this together, whatever comes. That's what marriage means, for better or worse, in sickness and health, through false accusations and true love. Despite everything." Cordelia smiled at his gentle humor. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. Wild, untamed sounds that spoke of survival against all odds. They would need that same wild strength for what lay ahead. The courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, felt like a tomb to Cordelia as she sat beside Judge Harrison at the defendant's table. The October air was thick with the smell of wood polish and old leather, and every creak of the wooden benches seemed to echo with judgment. 3 weeks had passed since they'd arrived in Ohio. 3 weeks of preparation and witness interviews and the slow, grinding machinery of frontier justice. Now, as she looked out over the packed courtroom, Cordelia could see faces from her past, some sympathetic, others curious, and a few openly hostile. Jasper Crowley sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, his bloodshot eyes fixed on her with malicious satisfaction. He'd grown even more dissipated in the 7 years since she'd last seen him, his face bloated from drink and his clothes shabby despite the obvious effort he'd made to appear respectable for court. Boone sat directly behind her, his presence a constant source of strength. Every few minutes, she would turn slightly to meet his eyes, drawing courage from the unwavering love she saw there. Judge Harrison had proven to be as formidable an advocate as he was a jurist, spending hours preparing her testimony and gathering evidence that painted a very different picture of the night in question. "The prosecution will now call its first witness," announced District Attorney Pemberton, a thin man with ambitious eyes who saw this case as his ticket to higher office. "Mr. Jasper Crowley to the stand." Crowley swaggered to the witness chair with the exaggerated confidence of a man who'd been drinking since breakfast. As he was sworn in, his words slurred slightly, though he tried to cover it with pompous formality. "Mr. Crowley," Pemberton began, "please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of October 15, 1880. "I saw her." Crowley pointed directly at Cordelia, his finger wavering slightly. "Saw her clear as day, sneaking around that church with a can of lamp oil, pouring it all around the walls. She was muttering to herself about making her daddy pay." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Cordelia felt her cheeks burn, but Judge Harrison's steady hand on her arm kept her calm. "And what time was this?" Pemberton continued. "Must have been around 6 o'clock, just before the evening service. Was to start. I was walking past, heading home from town." He avoided mentioning the saloon where he'd spent the afternoon, but everyone in the courtroom knew his habits. "Why didn't you report this at the time?" Crowley's face flushed. "Well, I figured nobody would believe me. And then when she got burned up in the fire, seemed like justice was served, if you take my meaning." Judge Harrison rose for cross-examination, his bearing dignified and calm. "Mr. Crowley, you mentioned you were coming from town at 6 o'clock. Were you perhaps coming from Murphy's saloon?" "I might have stopped in for a drink," Crowley admitted reluctantly. "Just one drink?" Harrison's tone was politely skeptical. "Maybe 2 or 3. A man's entitled to a drink after a hard day's work." "Indeed. And what was this hard day's work you'd been doing?" Crowley shifted uncomfortably. "I was looking for employment." "At the saloon?" Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, drawing chuckles from the gallery. "Objection?" Pemberton called. "Relevance?" "Your Honor," Harrison addressed the judge, "I'm establishing the witness's condition and reliability at the time of his alleged observation." "Overruled." "Continue, counselor." Harrison turned back to Crowley. "Mr. Crowley, isn't it true that you harbored considerable ill will toward Reverend Ashworth?" "I wouldn't say considerable." "Weren't you forcibly removed from his church on multiple occasions for disrupting services?" Crowley's face reddened further. "That man had no right to refuse to marry me and Bella Morrison just because she was still technically married to that husband who ran off." "Ah, yes. So you did have reason to resent the Reverend, and by extension, his daughter. That don't mean I made up what I saw." Judge Harrison walked to his table and picked up a document. "Mr. Crowley, this is a statement from Dr. Phillips, who treated Miss Ashworth after the fire. According to his medical records, she suffered burns over 30% of her body, with the most severe damage to her left side. These injuries were consistent with someone who had been trapped against the left wall of the church when the roof collapsed." He showed the document to Crowley. "If Miss Ashworth had set this fire as you claim, starting from the outside and working her way in, wouldn't she have exited the building before the collapse?" Crowley squirmed. "Maybe she got trapped somehow. Maybe the fire spread faster than she expected. Or maybe," Harrison said quietly, "she was inside helping Mrs. Patterson find her lost Bible. As 3 other witnesses have testified, when someone else's carelessly thrown cigarette or lamp started the blaze." The courtroom was completely silent. Now Harrison returned to his table and picked up another paper. "Mr. Crowley, I have here a sworn statement from Tom Bradley, the bartender at Murphy's saloon. He states that on the evening of October 15, 1880, you were in his establishment from approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon until well past 8 o'clock that evening. You were, and I quote, drunk as a skunk and passed out in the corner. Booth during the time you claim to have witnessed Miss Ashworth's alleged arson." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Crowley's face went from red to pale to red again. That's not, I mean ... "No further questions, Your Honor." As Crowley stumbled back to his seat, clearly defeated, Cordelia felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced since receiving that telegram. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead, her own testimony, where she would have to relive that terrible night and convince 12 strangers of her innocence. Judge Harrison leaned over to whisper in her ear, "That was the easy part, my dear. Now we show them who you really are." Cordelia's legs trembled as she walked to the witness stand, every eye in the courtroom following her movement. She wore the blue dress from her wedding day. Widow Prescott had insisted it would remind people of her happiness rather than her troubles, and she held her head high despite the whispers that followed her scarred profile. As she placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, she caught sight of Boone's face in the gallery. His green eyes held such fierce love and pride that her trembling stopped. Whatever happened here today, she was no longer the frightened girl who'd been sold at auction. She was Cordelia Harwick, beloved wife, respected healer, and survivor. "Mrs. Harwick," Judge Harrison began gently, "please tell the court about the evening of October 15th, 1880. Cordelia's voice started softly but grew stronger as she spoke. It was a Tuesday evening service. Father always held them weekly to encourage midweek prayer. I had arrived early to help prepare the communion elements and to arrange the flowers that Mrs. Patterson had brought from her garden. What time did you arrive at the church? Around 5:30. The service was to begin at 7, but I always came early to help Father prepare. And what were your duties that evening? I was arranging the altar flowers and helping Mrs. Patterson, who was quite elderly and had trouble seeing in the dim light. She dropped her Bible somewhere in the pews and was quite distressed about it. I stayed to help her search while Father went to the parsonage to fetch his sermon notes." Judge Harrison nodded. "What happened next?" Cordelia closed her eyes, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "I found Mrs. Patterson's Bible wedged between two pew cushions near the back of the church. As I was helping her back to the front, she walked with a cane. I smelled smoke. What did you do?" "At first, I thought someone had lit a cigarette outside, but then I saw flames beginning to lick up the left wall near where the altar candles were kept. I shouted for Mrs. Patterson to get out, and I ran toward the flames to try to beat them down with my shawl." "Why didn't you run outside immediately?" Cordelia's voice broke slightly. "Because Mrs. Patterson couldn't move quickly. I was afraid she wouldn't make it out on her own. I kept shouting for her to hurry while I tried to stop the fire from spreading." "What happened then?" "The flames spread faster than I could have imagined. The old wood was so dry, and there must have been some kind of accelerant, though not from anything I'd done. By the time I realized I couldn't stop it, the ceiling was beginning to collapse. I tried to run, but a burning beam fell across the aisle, trapping me against the left wall." Cordelia's hand unconsciously went to her scarred cheek. "That's when I was burned. I remember thinking I was going to die there, and my last thought was of Boone wondering if he would ever know how much I'd loved him." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even District Attorney Pemberton looked uncomfortable with his prosecution. "Mrs. Harwick," Judge Harrison continued, "did you set fire to that church?" "No," Cordelia said firmly, looking directly at the jury. "I nearly died trying to save it, and I carry the proof of that on my face every day." During cross-examination, Pemberton's questions were half-hearted at best. It was clear that Crowley's credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed that the prosecution's case had collapsed entirely. But the real turning point came when Judge Harrison called his final witness. The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. A collective gasp went up from the gallery as a small, elderly woman made her way slowly to the witness stand. Many people had believed Mrs. Patterson had died in the fire, as she disappeared from the community shortly afterward. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Harrison said gently, "please tell the court what you remember about the night of October 15th, 1880. The old woman's voice was thin but clear. "I remember that dear girl risking her life to save mine. When I dropped my Bible and couldn't find it in that dim church, she stayed to help me look, even though she could have gone home. And when the fire started and I saw how it started, she could have run past me and saved herself. Instead, she kept pushing me toward the door, kept shouting at me to hurry." "You saw how the fire started?" "Oh, yes. That Crowley man came stumbling out of the woods behind the church, drunk as a lord and angry as a wet hen. He was cursing Father Ashworth something fierce, and he threw his cigarette right at the building. It landed in some dry leaves that had blown up against the wall, and they caught fire immediately. The courtroom erupted in voices. Judge Harrison had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. "Mrs. Patterson," he continued when quiet returned, "why didn't you testify to this 7 years ago?" The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was so overcome with guilt. That girl nearly died saving my life, and I was too much of a coward to speak up when people started whispering about her father's troubles. After the fire, my son took me back east to live with him. I only came back when I heard about these terrible accusations." She turned to look directly at Cordelia. "I've lived with that shame for 7 years, child. I couldn't let you suffer for one moment longer." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood with tears in his eyes. "We find the defendant not guilty of all charges," he announced. "Furthermore, we recommend that charges be brought against Jasper Crowley for perjury and filing false accusations." As the courtroom erupted in cheers, Cordelia felt Boone's strong arm sweep her up in an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground. Over his shoulder she could see Crowley being led away by the sheriff, his face twisted with rage and defeat. "It's over," Boone whispered in her ear. "It's finally over." But even as relief flooded through her, Cordelia knew it wasn't really over, it was beginning. They were free now to build their life together without the shadow of the past hanging over them. Free to love without fear, to heal without suspicion, to finally, truly come home. As they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, Mrs. Patterson caught up with them on the steps. "Mrs. Harwick," she said, pressing a small wrapped package into Cordelia's hands, "this belonged to your father. I saved it from the fire that night, thinking someday I might be able to return it." Cordelia unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing her father's Bible, the one he'd carried every Sunday, the one he'd used to marry dozens of couples over the years. On the inscription page, in his careful handwriting, was a message she'd never seen before. "For my beloved daughter Cordelia, may you find in these pages the same love and redemption that has blessed our family. Your loving father, Jacob Ashworth." With tears streaming down both sides of her face, scarred and smooth alike, Cordelia clutched the Bible to her chest and looked up at her husband. In his eyes, she saw their future spread out before them like a promise. Children to raise, patience to heal, a community to serve, and a love that had already survived the worst that life could throw at it. They had come full circle from that first meeting in her father's church to this moment on the courthouse steps. But now they understood that the real journey was just beginning, not as two broken people trying to heal separately, but as one unbreakable bond, tested by fire and proven true. The late afternoon Ohio sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber as they walked toward the train station that would take them home to Montana. Home to Cedar Creek, home to their cabin on Timber Ridge, home to the life they would build together, one day at a time, one healing touch at a time, one moment of perfect love at a time. Behind them, the courthouse bells chimed the hour, but they no longer sounded like a funeral toll. Instead, they rang like wedding bells, celebrating not just their legal victory, but their triumph over fear, over shame, over all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Cordelia Harwick walked toward the train with her head held high, her scars worn like badges of honor, her husband's hand warm and steady in hers. She had been bought for $2 at an auction, but she had found something priceless, a love worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth everything they had endured to find each other again. The lonely lumberjack and the woman with the sack on her head had become something neither could have been alone. They had become home.